But on the topic of Hegel, that's a great place to start because Hegel is probably the most well-known representative figure of German idealism. And without going too far into the history of ideas, if we think about German idealism, we think of people like Fichte, we think of Schelling, we think of Hegel, we think of Kant, and these are Enlightenment era figures who place tremendous emphasis on reason, but they're distinct from their counterparts in the British realm of philosophy that were their contemporaries, people like Hume, Kant, and Berkeley. So they focus on empiricism. The German idealists, obviously, by that very title, focus on idealism. So we have to start there and understand what that is. And for a layman, idealism is the idea that when we look out in the world and we see objects out there and we have the phenomena of experience, there's different ways that we might categorize all of that. And for the British people of this time, the empiricists, their tendency was to say, well, those are just experiences that hit us on one realm, right? They hit us on the realm of the five senses, and that's it. There may be other things out there like God or spirit, angels or whatever, but as far as we know, we can only tap into things that touch us on the level of the five senses, and that's called empiricism.
Yes.
Now, over against that is the school roughly titled idealism. And idealism is the opposite. It says, no, we have these sensations, these sense impressions, these things that come to us through sight, sound, smell, etc. But that's not the totality of reality. The totality of reality is actually ideal. It's conceptual. It's the psyche. That's what reality is really all about. That's what is the fundamental structure or fabric of reality, is in some way ideals, or ideas or forms. So this is more so in line with Plato and Platonism. Platonism is a form of idealism. And so that's where we put Hegel. And so what Hegel says in his radical idealism is that he says basically he's in there. I don't want to get too off track, but you can be an empiricist idealist. There is such a thing as that. So there are always anomalies. So yes. George Berkeley was an empiricist idealist. So he thought that sense impression was all that there was, but all the sense impressions were ideas. And that's kind of true of Hegel in the sense that he thinks that to be is to be perceived. He would agree with that notion from Berkeley. And the most famous dictum for understanding Hegel is the real is the rational and the rational is the real. And that means essentially that whatever's out there in the world, it's not when you go out there and you knock on the wood, you touch the tree, you touch the ground, you're receiving the impression, the sensation of it being solid. But solidity in these kinds of things are just ideas. These are ideals, and all of reality is encapsulated into the realm of the ideal. So it's all psyche. So in a way we could call it panpsychism. And so for Hegel, reality is not, we're so used to things from the Newtonian perspective of, of gravity and cause and effect and all that. It's very different for Hegel in that mindset. For Hegel, all of reality is spirit, Geist in the German, and it's in a process of movement and attainment towards self-consciousness. So for Hegel, all of reality is psyche, and what we're seeing in history is the outplaying of the self-realization of psyche. So quite literally for Hegel, all reality and all objects in reality, be they animate or inanimate, are participating in this process of self-realization of the absolute or of the spirit or of the ideal. Now, that is called roughly process philosophy, and this is the key, because process philosophy will also have its form in the British thinkers with people like Alfred North Whitehead, and in some degree Bertrand Russell, and the Royal Society thinkers, because they will latch on to a lot of this process philosophy, as will Karl Marx, they will just simply dispense with all that idealism. So they'll toss out all the formal conceptual abstractions and the idea of Plato's formalism, and they'll just, as it's famously said about Marx, they'll stand Hegel on his head. And by that it's meant to suggest that, there's all this process and there's all this dialectical interchange and movement towards this the synthesis, which I'll explain here in a second. But that's all just matter, right? And that's where the Marx and the Royal Society will take this school of thought. But real quickly, back to Hegel. So what he did I was brushing up before we got on here. I hadn't looked at phenomenology of the spirit in a long time. So I was brushing up, looking at this thing. And I've got all these notes in it from back in my undergrad days. And this thing, I mean, my personal view of Hegel is that he's at the same time the most insightful and interesting guy, and then at the same time the most gobbledygook nonsense guy. So half the time I don't care who you are or how smart you are, half the time you're reading this thing, you have no idea what he's talking about, and then you'll get this section where you're like, oh, okay, I think I get what he's saying here. Oh, that's really insightful. And then he goes right back into like, jargon and gobbledygook. You have no idea what he's talking about. But we can get a general sense of what he's getting at, and it's what I've said so far. And commentators, secondary sources on Hegel have roughly sketched out that it's triadic. So what Hegel did was take the theology of the Trinity, Trinitarianism and triadism, and he sort of philosophized it, and he just sort of collapsed it into the realm of phenomena, right, which is the phenomena of human experience. And there are all these triads everywhere, and what we have to do is understand that the triadic process is dialectical. So he would say something to the effect of, when you come into a room and you see a chair, and that's the first time that you've seen a chair, well, that's a new phenomenon for you because it's the first time you've seen that chair. It's also a new phenomenon for the chair. And so this process of you and the chair in this dialogue, if you're not completely insane talking to chairs or something,
right?
This is actually a real philosophical, metaphysical process where both you and this chair and this exchange of knowledge are being raised to a higher level of being, that is closer to the final state of absolute self-consciousness, or the omega point, or whatever we want to call it. So this dialectical exchange is going on consistently throughout everybody's lives and throughout the whole of history. So Hegel has a completely wide scope, wide sweeping, universal philosophy at work here. Now, that dialectical process is across the board. So this applies to everything from politics to theology to nature to art to aesthetics to history, whatever you want to say. And this is where it applies to Marxism. So Marx comes along, and after being influenced by these German atheists like Feuerbach, Marx says, I like a lot of this German idealism. He was one of the young Hegelians, which is a movement in Germany at that time, a philosophical movement. But he decides that through the influence of Feuerbach and these other German atheists that all this spirit talk is a bunch of BS. That's all nonsense. Throw that out. And so this is, of course, after the influence of the British empiricists like Hume and Locke and others that I mentioned. And what they would do is also dispense with a lot of this metaphysics. So Marx is coming along as a German, influenced by the German idealists, as well as by the British empiricists and the British and the later British philosophy of Darwinism. So this is crucial for Marxism. You can't understand Marx without understanding Darwinian process in terms of biology, and ultimately I think it's a mythology, and then combined with Hegelian philosophy and idealism and its process, just minus all the metaphysical baggage, right? So next we're going to look at this book, Hegel and Hermeticism, because, and I think this, I can't remember if he argues that this is like a Hegelian drawing, right? This is a Hegel's drawing of how the dialectic of the synthesis works, and you can see that it is an actual occult drawing, right? So it's like triangles on top of triangles on top of triangles, right? This is the dialectical process of thesis, antithesis producing the synthesis. And people have tried to argue with me over the years that that's not what Hegel says. He don't really teach that. No, Hegelian philosophers show that that is what he says, and that is what I had Hegel classes, and all my professors told me that that's what Hegel teaches. And I'm talking about people who studied under Marxist Hegelians. So again, none of these people. So internet goobers that are 20 years old know more than the PhDs in Hegel. My undergrad professor wrote his thesis on Hegel and Marx. So my advisor studied under the guy who studied under Habermas, writes his PhD thesis on Hegel. I think he would know what Hegel teaches. All right. So there you see the triadic thesis structure, and note that this has nothing to do with the Christian Trinity. It's another example of why you can't do thesis and why you can't do a word concept fallacy here, because Hegel says, "Well, I believe in the Trinity," and then you ask Hegel what the Trinity is, and it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? I mean, Hegel's Trinity is immanentized into the world historical process. Okay, that's Hegel's Trinity. God is the absolute of all historical process in Hegel. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, moving to the omega point, moving to the absolute, where everything becomes absolute spirit. So in Dr. McGee's text, he goes into the historical influences on Hegel from the esoteric tradition, and we're going to name some of these figures. The first he calls the early Hermeticists that had an influence, such as the Neoplatonic philosophers. Hegel admired Proclus quite a bit, so he was influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. I think that's pretty obvious, pretty well known. Another famous mystic from that time period was Meister Eckhart. Eckhart was a mystic in Gotha about 1260. He died in 1327. No one has demonstrated the direct Hermetic influence on Eckhart, but his thought exhibits certainly Hermetic influences co-opted out of German Hermeticists in later times. Eckhart's significance for German philosophy and intellectual culture cannot be overestimated. In fact, Eckhart dominates for many centuries German mystical philosophy afterwards, and certainly the apophatic and I would argue that Eckhart's a manifestation of Roman Catholic theological inadequacies of that time, because you'll notice that it's a Trinitarian heresy in Eckhart. Eckhart preached that just as the Son requires the Father to give him existence, so the Father is not Father without the Son. Thus, God would not be God without the created order. So we have the problem of modal collapse and the notion of creation as a necessity and not ex nihilo. That always results out of absolute divine simplicity problems in the West. So filioque, which is again the mystical filioque of Plotinus's Enneads is what underlies Eckhart. God would not be God without creation. God must create to actualize who he is. This is actually an Aristotelian argument. This is why Basil calls Aristotle a dyad heretic. This is one of the most innovative of Eckhart's Hermetica. Just as in Hegel, more than 500 years later, God the Father is conceived of as an abstract and incomplete. The nature or creation is the Son. The Son is an emanation that returns to the Father, and thus the Holy Spirit, as in Hegel, is mankind. So again, what is Hegelianism? Immanentized pantheism. It's Neoplatonism pantheized. Nicholas of Cusa, again, the famous Hermeticist, who, on the basis of the filioque, argued that there was an internal process philosophy going on in God. And Nicholas of Cusa, by the way, influences not just German idealism, but also Leibniz's monads. Creation is a necessity in Nicholas of Cusa because Nicholas of Cusa identifies nature and person. much the same way that people like Aquinas do. Now, wait a minute. You're lying. Aquinas believes in creation ex nihilo. Yeah, that's called a contradiction. So, collapsing nature into person, collapsing will and energy into essence, and then saying that you believe in creation ex nihilo does not believe that you consistently believe it. Does not mean you consistently believe in it. It just means you contradict. Other Renaissance Neoplatonists had a tremendous influence on Hegel, particularly Jacob Boehme, and the overlaps with Kabbalism. Pico della Mirandola, Johann Reuchlin, Cornelius Agrippa, who was a famous Renaissance magus, and Giordano Bruno, all have a tremendous influence on the figure of Hegel and his process philosophy. For Boehme and many of these characters, logos is not the second person of the Godhead. As with Gnostic conceptions of the logos, Jacob Boehme's wisdom or logos is conceived of as an active. It is the source of the further specifications of God's corporeality. For Boehme, God's wisdom or logos is conceived of as female. It's metaphorically female. So here we have Sophia Philosophia Bulgakov already in Jacob Boehme, which is also heterodox. And wisdom is personified as a female in Proverbs and then identified as the logos, the second person of the Godhead in John. So it's an analogy. It doesn't mean that God is literally a woman or that the logos is a woman or that there's some other person in the Trinity known as Sophia or this quasi-Trinitarian This is all Hermeticism, right? So when you see the Hermetic philosophy, you can see that Bulgakov is just regurgitating Hermetic philosophy. So Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry are becoming very popular also at the time of Hegel's academic career. Three works modestly proposed the general reformation of the entire world. The Rosicrucian Manifesto centered around the legendary figure of Christian Rosenkreuz, who was supposed to have been born in 1378 and taught the Hermetic arts by the Arabs and then died in 1484. The Rosicrucian writings contain, in the words of scholar Antoine Favre, traces of Kabbalah, Pythagoreanism, and Paracelsusm. The Rosicrucian manifestos then would influence Hegel, I presume, at his when he was an academic. Hegelian philosophy also is similar to Freemasonic philosophy because, as I showed, I think I put this up on Twitter several months ago. If you look at Albert Pike's account of what the Trinity and the generation of the Son is, it's the same as these Hermetic ones. And I found this by going and reading the entire chapter that Albert Pike has on the Church Fathers. Believe it or not, Albert Pike has a chapter on the Church Fathers in Morals and Dogma. And the amazing thing that I did not expect was Pike's conclusion at the end of that chapter is that Origen and Neoplatonism are the true Christianity. Isn't that wild? Let me see if I can find that. Dang it. It never comes up when I want it. Used to, you could search. Maybe I should search X. Oh, it's not going to come up. Used to, you could search. Oh, here it is. Huh, amazing. Yeah, it came up. And I'll reshare this on Twitter in case people want to go see it. But so this is Morals and Dogma of Albert Pike, kind of summarizing. It's like the systematic theology or systematic philosophy of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And I'm just showing that it says and it aligns with what we've been reading so far in these treatises to show a commonality between Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, which Albert Pike tries to synthesize all these, right? And he says that the true Christianity
is a generic first cause, and he makes an Aristotelian argument there, of a necessary creation from the one of Plato that is an emanation. And then he says, so the eternal world is necessary because God is an eternal creator. He makes Origen's argument. This is Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma, page 575. And as the thought of the soul emanating from the soul becomes audible and visible in words, so did the thought of God, the Logos, springing up within himself, immortal as himself, when once he conceived, immortal before, because in himself, utter in himself was the Word, the Logos, its manifestation and mode of communication thus create material, mental, spiritual universe, which, like him, never began to exist. The world is an eternal emanation that is synonymous with the eternal begetting of the Son. This is the real idea of the ancient nations. Generic God, the Almighty Father and the source of all, and his thought, conceiving the universe and willing its creation, because it is just as necessary as his essence. That is a modal collapse argument in Albert Pike, the same argument that Origen makes for eternal worlds. Because if God is eternal God, an eternal Father, an eternal Creator, there must be eternal world of which he is provident Lord and Creator. And that world is the Son or the Logos. So you have the collapsing of the persons of the Godhead into the immanent process of the world. God is world process. The Logos is the world historical world process. Exactly what Hegel says. So I don't know for sure if Hegel was in some lodge. If he was, it'll be in Terry Melanson's excellent book, which is, I think, is to date probably the most scholarly work on the 17th century Bavarian Illuminati. So if you don't have Perfectibilis, it's by my publisher. I recommend getting Perfectibilis. I don't have the text with me, so I can't remember or look up if Hegel was in it. But I know that the King of Prussia was a Freemason. And many of the circles of the Prussian elite were totally involved in the philosophy of the Lodge, which, as you can see from Pike, is essentially a kind of Origenism / pantheism / Neoplatonism.